All right, in this video I wanted to quickly go over different ways to load your scripts and the way the browser operates. So let's take a look at this diagram here from growingwiththeweb.com. Really excellent visual representation of how the browser parses the DOM and the HTML. Okay, so the green area is HTML parsing. All right, gray is where that parsing is paused. The kind of bluish here is script download, right? And then the reddish is script execution. Okay, so this implies enough HTML that as it goes through and parses the HTML, and what do we mean by parsing? We first have to download the HTML file, right? And that is a bunch of string characters, right? It's just a text file. And then the browser looks at this text file and has to go through and get meaning from these symbols, right? So that's what parsing is. It's extracting meaning from usually a string of some kind. Okay, so we've got this string of HTML, so we have to go through and parse what that means and then construct this document object model, right? This is what's used to render the actual HTML page. So all these HTML elements have a sort of meaning, and we have to parse that meaning out of just the plain text. Now, at some point, we have a page. As we're parsing these individual elements, right, we would have had to download this entire body of text, right? And then we start parsing, and parsing is just, what does this element mean? What are its child elements? That sort of thing. Okay, so here we have, eventually we get to this script tag, and the standard operating procedure here is to, as you're parsing, when you encounter the script tag, you stop parsing the rest of the HTML, and then you go ahead and download that script, because this is a separate script, and then you run that script, and then you can continue executing. All right, that's the standard operating procedure with the script, but there's lots of problems with this. Okay, so for example, let's say I want to interact with something in the HTML page. Say I wanted to grab this element, all right, the H1 element. So what I can do is console.log, and I want to say document.get elements by tag name, right? And then pass in H1. We could also use a query selector, any number of ways of doing this. So this should be an array of elements, right? All of the elements on the page that are the H1 tag, right? And we only have one. Okay, so if I run this, keep in mind the visual representation of what's happening here. The HTML is loading. We reach the script tag. Now our H1 tag is actually down here, but we haven't gotten to that parsing yet. All right. Now I'm going to demonstrate something that's very confusing and has caused me personally a lot of pain in development until I realized this about console.log. Console.log is a little bit dangerous. Okay, so we would think that when we execute this, we would get undefined. Okay, because we have started executing. Oops, sorry. We've started executing the script, and we look on the page to see if this thing exists, and it clearly does not. We have not parsed it yet. Okay, and so we console log that out, right? So that's what we would expect. Now this is what makes it difficult. So it looks like we do have an element. We have an H1 element, and it is this. Okay, so the reason this is happening is because console.log, it varies implementation to implementation of the different browsers, but it can be asynchronous. It has something to do with the objects. Okay, so what I'm printing an object here. It's an array, and there's nothing inside of it. But then, before it actually prints out to this console, I am adding something to it. All right, so it's a little bit frustrating because that's just an unusual way for things to work, right? So console.log is not perfect. Now I'm bringing that up because I can prove to you that's the case. We have this element here, and I can say on this element I want to look at the element 0.inner text. Okay, so here this is the standard execution of the script. We're parsing HTML. We encounter the script tag. Our H1 tag is down here. So now we're running, downloading and then running. Okay. So when we go back to execute this thing, make sure it's saved, reload the page, uncaught type error, cannot read properties of undefined, reading inner text. Okay. So what is this saying? It's saying when I grab the 0th element of this array, that's undefined. and that should be undefined, right? Because it doesn't exist. And then I'm calling inner text on undefined, right? So this is different behavior than just a moment ago when I didn't have this portion of it. When I just referenced the object was later filled in. So the object was an array, and it was filled in after this JavaScript was executed, and then the console.log finished executing and printed out this object. Okay, so that's a very, very confusing part of JavaScript. Just be aware when you're printing out objects, occasionally console.log will print out things that you have added to them after the fact, right? So if I print out this object and then I add things to it after the fact, in my actual display, sometimes I will get those elements in here even though I added them after I console.log. So it's always best to console.log strings or base values, right? Like any kind of basic value, like a number or a string or a Boolean value of some sort. Okay, so that's a little bit confusing. So I wanted to demonstrate that point. All right, but let's go back to referencing this, because this should work if I move my script tag. Let's see, I move my script tag from here. Very often it's taught to put your script tags at the bottom of the body element. That way all of your HTML that you could possibly be interacting with on the page has already loaded, okay? So in this scenario, we're still using just a standard script, right? It's just the position where we're loading it, okay? So if we go back to our visualization here, it's still loading HTML, but here is where we've loaded the H1 tag. And so now when I execute this stuff, we download and execute, I should have access to that H1 tag, all right? And so this is with the standard script, so not these other two versions with the additional attributes. All right, so if I reload the page now, we do see that the inner text of the H1 tag is the event loop, okay? Whereas we did it just before in the head tag, and it is not, okay? So this is a quirk with console.log. That's very important, you realize, but also just loading scripts. Most of the time when you start learning about loading scripts, you don't get into the defer and async keywords, okay? So what are these keywords? What do they do, okay? And again, this article from Growing with the Web is real short, but this visualization is really, really great, okay? So the idea is you can add the async attribute, all right? And what that does is it allows you to download the file. So this would be where we encounter the script tag in our HTML parsing. And we go ahead and send a request to download the file, and then the file downloads in the background. Meanwhile, we are still parsing the HTML. As soon as that file downloads, then we execute the JavaScript, right? As soon as there's a pause in our parsing where we can just execute the JavaScript. Then after it executes, then we continue parsing out the HTML and rendering, okay? So this ties into the event loop, which we're going to talk about next, but I wanted to get this point across first because it's very important. How you load your JavaScript matters. So this was the async keyword. Now the key thing here is this only executes while this is downloading. This download time could be short on a fast computer, or it could be really, really long, and it depends on how much HTML you have to process and what's going on your computer. So this basically means we have no idea when this is going to execute, okay? So you only want to use the async keyword when you don't care when the code executes, all right? And for most of our cases, that's not the case. In a production environment or something like that, a professional environment, you might use the async keyword quite a bit more. For most of our purposes, it's probably best to use defer. How does defer differ? As we go through, we're parsing the HTML, we get to the point of our script tag, and then our script tag downloads. But we continue to parse the HTML, right? So this download is happening in a separate thread, okay? So we always hear JavaScript is single-threaded, and that's true. However, the browser is not necessarily single-threaded, right? The execution of your JavaScript is done on one single thread, but there's also this idea of an event loop, and where things like this can take place in parallel to execution of JavaScript or the rendering of an HTML page, okay? So JavaScript is single-threaded, but even Node.js, it has an event loop that has a separate thread for doing certain things, okay? But your JavaScript itself is always going to be single-threaded, all right? So defer keyword, we get to the script tag, we download and continue parsing in parallel, but then when we're done downloading, unlike async, we ran it right away and pause the rendering. We just keep rendering, right? And then once everything is rendered, then we execute. Okay, so this is the safest way to do things. The whole DOM is guaranteed to be rendered, and so if you're interacting with the DOM, you'll have access to that. It's also, the DOM is rendered fastest, so you have something visual on your page sooner. Okay, so sometimes you'll see a page and it takes a really, really long time to load, right? Notice the overall time to DOM being complete and interactive is less with this one, and so you would see something visual sooner, right? And it, of course, depends on how you lay everything out. It might not make a difference, but you can get a noticeable benefit, especially if these scripts are, long running, right? So if this this bar, for example, was this long instead, the entire page would take much longer, whereas here we'd see the page render sooner, and then our script would execute. All right, so really good little visual representation on this article. And the last bit I want to show you is these different attributes in use. Okay, so if we use the attributes, the main one that I want to show you is defer. Defer is essentially going to be equivalent for our purposes of just having the script down here. Now it's not exactly equivalent because different events are thrown when the DOM is loaded versus when the entire script has loaded, right? So it's not exactly the same, but for most of our purposes, we can just, let's go back here. We can just do this, okay? Script, defer, and if we defer all of our scripts, they will be executed in the order that they show up. Okay, so even if one downloads first, it doesn't matter. With defer, they will be executed in the order in which you specify them. Now that's important difference with async. Async scripts, if one is a smaller size, it's probably going to download first and therefore execute first. Okay, so async is really for anything that does not depend on any other scripts, any other items, any other HTML. Okay. So again, most of our purposes, script defer just makes our life easier, and then we can keep all of our scripts up in the top in the head element. Okay. So again, we see with defer, we're going to grab that get elements by tag name, and we have the inner text. So this should work because we're going to pull down the JavaScript, and while we're parsing the HTML, then after it's parsed, that's when we can grab the element. Okay, so again, the difference is just, if I remove defer, we see that goes away. All right, undefined. Okay, so most of our purposes, we're just going to use defer. All right, that's good enough for this video, and we're going to move into the event loop in the very next video.